Thank you for being here, for staying for the afternoon as well. Again, my name is Alex Orozco with the Network Against Human Trafficking. I am very, very pleased to have here Tiffany Williams from the Break the Chain campaign. Break the Chain campaign is a very important national organization who, early in the movement against trafficking, began to work at a national level to advocate specifically for those who are in forced labor conditions. Many of the clients and people that work with are people from Africa. Tiffany's going to talk about that. But forced labor is the other side of trafficking. Forced labor is basically anything else that is not a commercial sex act. As President Lincoln once said, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is not wrong. Then nothing is wrong. Then nothing is wrong. So starting with that premise, we're going to talk today about specific examples of forced labor cases. We're going also to learn in depth how the forced labor trafficking occurs. From the cases that Bonnie Campbell was talking about on the podium, there was a time in my life when I was receiving news bits from an organization worldwide that was capturing news pieces on trafficking cases from all over the world and sending those daily digests. So every time I come to work, I look at the summary of these beautiful cases of human trafficking occurring all over the world. And that really opened my horizons in terms of the scope and the horrific situations that many of these people go through. I remember one that has marked my mind deeply. It was one of women being moved from Hong Kong to somewhere else, and the traffickers having them in the boat threw them into the ocean, about 120 of them, because the Coast Guard or law enforcement was approaching. So many of them didn't know how to swim. So they let them go as a way to get away, because law enforcement would have to make a choice between rescue the women or capturing them. And for what I remember, if my memory doesn't fail me, a vast majority of them did die, did drown. So from cases like this, where the victim's life resulted in death, to severe trauma, to injuries that would never a person could recover from children who know nothing but work, who grew up working and supporting their own families for various circumstances and reasons. We're going to talk about this today and the scope of this problem. Forced labor continues to be the largest portion of human trafficking versus sex trafficking, but not that far. Sex trafficking is about 40% of the total trafficking cases in the world, while forced labor is about 60% of it.
That was a very timely. That was perfect. Your introduction right when the PowerPoint started working. Thank you. Great. So as Alex said, my name is Tiffany Williams. I am the Advocacy Director of Break the Chain, and I'm here to talk to you guys today about trafficking for forced labor. Before I go further, I want to be very clear about our intentional use of the way that the words are put here. We believe that human trafficking is a comprehensive crime that can take many forms. And so we usually say human trafficking, and then if people ask for what, we say for forced labor. Because we want to make sure that people understand that there isn't there's a distinction between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, like they're so very different. When in fact we know in our practice that people who are trafficked for labor often experience some of the same kind of physical, sexual assaults as people trafficked for sex, and so we want to be very clear that we're looking at the whole of human trafficking. That being said, this is going to focus on labor, traditional exploitation for labor. So I'm going to give you a few case studies, talk about some statistics, talk about some government response, a little note about social services, although I might cut that for the time. And then I see a lot of young people in the room, so I'm guessing you have students who are able to come, so that's great. There's the last thing I'll leave with is what you can do, because I like to leave with some kind of positive note after talking about things like this. So this is a story of one of our clients at Break the Chain, and I did this is an important practice note for people who plan to do work like what we're doing here. I got Evelyn's written permission to use her story and her face, and that's really important, just point of practice. We don't use client stories without consent. If we do refer to clients without their consent, we change identifying details. We don't show pictures. For this, we got Evelyn's consent because, and you'll see why later. So Evelyn was brought to the U.S. To work. She was actually brought and was promised that she would go to school, which is a pretty typical thing that we hear in our work. Was promised that she would go to school and live the American dream and have everything that she needed. But when she arrived, she was forced to cook and clean and take care of children who were not much younger than she was. She came when she was only 11. The family members that she took care of, which were her second cousins, were only 8, 9. I mean, they were just a little bit younger than her. And she would have to walk them to school, and when she went home, she would have to clean all day. If she complained, she was beaten. They used whips, they used other things to keep her in submission. And she was in this situation for 6 years before she was able to leave. But I'll come back to her, don't worry. So as you have heard all morning, which I think is great, trafficking can happen in a variety of industries. Ours, the one that we focus on the most is domestic servitude, but we have sister organizations who work in agriculture, people who work in construction. We hear of mining and logging, and if we have time, we want to show a little video of what some of the what mining looks like in different places, because it's actually a really dangerous industry in general, as we all know. But when you have children doing it and children forced to do it, it becomes a really horrible situation. We know about sweatshops and manufacturing. That's pretty standard knowledge for most of us to have. But then we're learning about indentured servitude and debt bondage. We have sex-related industries and even the service and restaurant industry. And on my way here yesterday from the airport, Alex was telling me a story about people who were we don't know if they were trafficked yet, or we don't know what the outcome was, but they were sent to work in Chinese restaurants. So we know that it happens in restaurants. In Maryland, where I'm from, we had a case where children were trafficked to do hair braiding. So in our opinion, trafficking can really happen any place that there is to make a profit. We know that people are vulnerable to exploitation. So another case example, this is from Florida. Agriculture in Florida, as some of you might have seen, especially the college students, you might be aware of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Taco Bell campaign, and I see nodding heads, so that's good. So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a worker-led organization in Immokalee, Florida, which is in the Southwest. And that is where a lot of the tomatoes and oranges that we eat come from. And the problem that farm workers have down there in general is poor wages and working conditions. But when you add in the possibility or threat of trafficking, it becomes a really an interesting target industry to look at for forced labor. So with this case, this is another example of how smuggling can turn into trafficking, and I think that Teresa actually mentioned this a few times in her talk this morning, which is that even if people enter into this voluntarily to begin with, so maybe they knew that they were crossing a border illegally, were coming to the U.S., when it turns into trafficking, when they're not allowed to leave, when the debt keeps rising and rising, then they're victims, and it doesn't matter how they came. So for these guys, they were ordered to pay a commission to the coyote who brought them over. But of course, the commission kept going up and up. And how the coyote decided to solve the problem was to find a labor contractor, which we think was already in place, who will pay the debt, and then the men would go work for this labor contractor who brought them to Florida. And they worked 8 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, picking tomatoes and citrus. And with this outcome of this case was actually good because the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, because it's worker-run, worker-led, they were able to hear about what was going on there, and they started their own mini investigation and were able to uncover enough that they were able to go to the FBI. And at that point, the FBI intervened and did a real investigation, and there was a conviction in that case. Question?
Yeah, just in the same case that you talked about, some of the workers were threatened by the trafficker to be thrown to the swamps with the crocodiles if they tried to escape. And this is a case of what we call debt bondage. You're held because you own a debt, your wages are going to be deducted, and you are going to endlessly pay that debt.
Yeah, and one more thing I'll mention about agriculture is that in Florida, we also have the issue of trafficking of U.S. citizen men. And there was another case down there where the traffickers were targeting homeless men who were addicted to drugs and actually paying them in drugs so that they would continue to be addicted and continue to work. So I mostly talk about trafficking of foreign-born people just because that's what I see more often, but people, U.S. citizens are not immune to trafficking for labor either. So here's a few case studies, and I put them here together because they're examples of people who were trafficked who came over on legal visas. And so to us, we put these here because we want to show that the U.S. government can intervene and can improve these visa programs to help prevent some of the trafficking that we've seen. So the H-2B visa is for temporary workers who are non-agricultural workers. And this case, the Signal case, and they're named for the company who was the recruiter. This case was workers who were brought over to work on rebuilding after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And there were 500 workers. And this case is still in progress, so I know that they said earlier that the largest case was the one in American Samoa, which is the Kilsuli factory, which is sweatshops. And that was 300 workers. So this one hasn't been finished yet, nor has this one, the Global Horizons case, which was 400 Thai workers doing agriculture. The H-2A is the agriculture visa. But these pictures, this one in particular, that's from the Signal case. This is a demonstration that was put together by an immigrant rights and worker rights organization in New Orleans. And so we're seeing a lot more as more of these cases come out, as more people learn about their rights. Actually, concurrently with the trafficking work that we do on service provision, we have this great new arm of organizing for rights to really bring these people's stories out. So we work collaboratively with all of the organizing groups to make sure that our survivors, when they leave our service program, can actually enter into these other organizations and organize for their rights. I'll mention a couple more here. So A3G5 domestic workers, that's Break the Chains area of specialty. These are domestic workers who come over to work for diplomats and employees of the World Bank and the IMF. And so that's a big problem in DC. We've had 300 domestic worker cases in the last 10 years. So we know that it's not a small problem, and that's just DC, and that's just our caseload. So these workers are particularly vulnerable because they work in the home. So there's not a real way to sort of identify trafficking, like if you were going to a restaurant or a field. In this case, you'd have to go to a home, and this is a home of a diplomat, which you can't really enter. So there are special provisions in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act for these A3G5 workers. The J-1 visa, how many of you guys have heard of the Hershey students in Hershey, Pennsylvania? So that wasn't a trafficking case per se. It's still being investigated. But it's an example of a visa program. These are students who came over from different countries to work in the Hershey factory. Actually, they came over on a J-1 visa, which is supposed to be part work and then part cultural immersion. Well, they got culturally immersed in the factory at Hershey. Thank you for laughing at my joke. So these students were sort of forced to work in this factory environment, which they weren't really trained for. Some of them were not physically able to do, but were forced to work there. They asked to be transferred to a different company to work for, or a different kind of work even, and they were denied. The trafficker, or I don't want to say that, the contractor forced them to live in certain housing and wouldn't allow them to leave that housing, so they had to stay in this specific apartment building where their rents were taken away from their paychecks. And when they investigated the sort of advocates investigated, the neighbors' rents were a third of what the students were paying. So this is still being investigated, but the problem with the J-1 visa is that it's not considered a work visa. So it's administered by the State Department rather than the Department of Labor. So when you have a wage and hour problem or a factory kind of problem, the DOL isn't able to just go in there and start investigating. It has to be coordinated through the State Department, who isn't equipped to do that kind of investigation, in our opinion. And then the last visa is this B-1 visa, which is a sort of nebulous visa. We had a lot of domestic workers come over on this visa to work for wealthy families. So we've had a lot of statistics today, so I hope this doesn't confuse you, but at Break the Chain, we use the ILO statistics, which is the International Labor Organization, which is part of the UN. And so it's just the best guess that we can come up with, and that's who we use. Because in fact, as you've heard a lot of, how to count trafficking is still TBD. So we have to figure out a way to measure it. And all of these numbers come from the same report, which if you're students, you should write down, or anybody. It's called Human Trafficking and Forced Labor, Estimating the Profits. And it's published by the ILO. And so here they break down people who are in forced labor. 2.5 million are forced to work by their own government or army, but we don't have time to go into that today. And then 9.8 million are exploited by private enterprise. 1.7 million in forced prostitution and 8.1 million in forced economic exploitation. And then of those who are trafficked, it's a little bit more equal. So this is what it looks like in graph form, since I'm a visual person. So you can see that for trafficking, forced labor in general, people who are exploited are mostly around the world exploited by forced economic exploitation, and we think that's because of the commonality of debt bondage. We think that's why that is so big in other countries. So these people may not be leaving their home countries, may not be traveling across borders, but are in forced labor because of debt bondage. So we think that's why the number is so high. So this probably won't surprise most of you, but there are a lot of factors that contribute to why people are vulnerable for trafficking or to trafficking. And at Break the Chain and with our partners, we really try to take a holistic point of view when it comes to human trafficking. We really value the work of law enforcement, and we really value the work of people who are trying to look to sort of bring justice and do prosecutions. But for us, one of the most important goals that we should have is to identify root causes. Why are people vulnerable to trafficking? Why do they leave their home countries? Or why are there, what's going on in their home countries that makes them vulnerable? So we know that there's a relation between global trade agreements that hurt farming economies. So if you look at NAFTA, for example, in Mexico, you'll see that there have been a lot of people who say that who are affected by that trade agreement, whose farms have been closed, or even in other countries where the trade agreement or the structural adjustment policy of the IMF or the World Bank says, okay, you can't do agriculture anymore, you have to urbanize, they'll burn down rainforests in Brazil and build a factory. And some people aren't prepared to do that kind of work. And the way that they've been sustaining themselves is taken away. With sweatshops and manufacturing in developing countries, we know that corporations looking to make a profit will find places where the labor standards are at their lowest so that they can make a higher profit. But what that does is it drives down wages. It's a spiraling effect that happens in other countries so that eventually it's a race to the bottom. So we think that undermining workers' rights in general affects the possibility that people will be trafficked. We hear a lot about lack of educational opportunities for girls, but what we're seeing is that it's true for boys too, that everybody is suffering when, for example, what Francis said this morning about the schools in his city being gone. I mean, there are a lot of, and this sort of relates to the last one, which is political instability, natural disasters. When you take away the infrastructure that people depend on, then they become vulnerable and more willing to leave and maybe more willing to enter into things that are risky. Government response. All right. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act has a lot of different provisions. And earlier this morning, I talked about some of the ones for social and legal services in the U.S. But I'll just talk about a couple here. One is that they made this new pamphlet through the State Department and advised by the Trafficking Persons Office, which Lou DeBaca runs. That is a pamphlet that explains the rights of workers in the U.S., and that was mandated by the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So that's getting sent out to consulates and given to workers before they arrive in the U.S. And there's obviously a lot more work to be done when it comes to that, but it's a start. And what we've heard from the service agencies is that people are calling the hotline now, the trafficking hotline, and they're saying, "Where did you hear about this number?" Or "Where did you hear about this?" And they'll reference the pamphlet. So we know it's getting out there. It's just, we have to do a lot more. The TVPA also has prevention work. It funds prevention work around the world. Some people have a critique of any kind of prevention work, unless it's really addressing root causes, it's only going to be putting a Band-Aid on it. So that is a continuing effort. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the TVPA is up for reauthorization right now, actually. It just came out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and it's now on the floor in the Senate, S1301. And unfortunately, one of the provisions that didn't make it in the Senate version, but might be in the House version, is protection against fraud and foreign labor contracting. So that would take care of a lot of the problems that we saw in one of the slides where I showed you the visa programs. So this would be a provision that would basically make a list of labor contractors who were good labor contractors and then a list of ones who were bad. But it would also put on sanctions and protections for victims who were victimized by fraudulent foreign labor contracting. So the other part of the TVPA, the other mandate is for the Department of Labor to make a list of goods that is a list of goods that were produced by child labor or forced labor. And it was required in the authorization of 2005, but the DOL first reported in 2009. So it took a while to get the numbers and the list, but now it's updated regularly. So the new one just came out a few weeks ago for 2011, and there are 130 goods on it, and goods are coffee, cotton, like sort of material kind of things, not companies. So that's an important critique of the list, obviously, is that they don't list the companies who get the cotton from the children in Kazakhstan or the cocoa from the children in the Ivory Coast. So it just lists the goods and the countries. This is my pet project. I would like to educate people about, as I mentioned in the beginning, that our clients are vulnerable to every kind of physical, sexual abuse, any kind of psychological torture, threats to families back home, all of these different things where people need social services. And so I think that it's sort of, I won't spend too much time on this because it feels like in this room and in the conference so far, people are really understanding that. So I don't have to preach to you. So a little note about how we do our work. We are a direct service organization and an advocacy organization, but we really put the human rights perspective first. And our work really is intended to promote self-sufficiency and empowerment. We don't use a victim saving model because we think that really puts most of when we say we're going to save victims, it makes it about us instead of about that person that we're working with. And so we use empowerment, survivorship, and we follow that person through her case, however long she wants to stay connected with us. So I'm going to show you this video, and hopefully it'll work. Okay, good, it does. So this is a follow-up on Evelyn, because I know that you're all wondering what happened to her. Oh, now you can see it.
She was just 10 years old. She was taken from her native country of Cameroon in West Africa. Her family named her True Woman, which in the U.S. would have right, but it wasn't.
So in that situation, I never spoke a word. I only spoke a word when I met my mentor, Melanie Arhart. And she was the first person that I can just really, truly open up to and tell them how I feel about things. And from there, I just became talkative and everything. I've always been a talkative person back home, but I was blocked for all those years without saying a word.
Once she arrived in Maryland, her captor forced her to cook, clean, and care for her children. At times, the woman would beat Evelyn into submission. Evelyn would eventually run away and seek help from authorities. The woman was convicted in federal court of involuntary servitude and harboring a juvenile for financial gain. She was sentenced to 17 years in prison. It was then that Evelyn got her GED and later enrolled at CCBC.
For me, to get an education was like the most biggest thing in my mind, and just to have friends, just to have somebody to talk to, because you just being in isolation for so many years. I was talking to trees, I was talking to myself, and not to be able to talk to people and feel free and even talk in front of the camera.
As a student on the CCBC Catonsville campus, Evelyn thrived. She got involved in student organizations. Faculty, staff, and students are inspired by her determination.
She was a fabulous student before I knew her story, and then once I learned her story, she's just an inspiration, and I was thrilled to know her.
Evelyn Chumbo has experienced more than any person should ever have to, but through it all, she remains a bright, intelligent woman. To receive her diploma from CCBC means everything to Evelyn. It's a symbol of the struggle and strength to get to this point. Evelyn hopes to become a motivational speaker to shed light on human trafficking in this country.
I would really like to see human trafficking be abolished, because me thinking that I was the only person in my situation, and then hearing other stories of other little kids and being afraid to talk about it, and a lot of people in the African communities are afraid to share their story of being trafficked, coming in here, being enslaved, being abused by their own people, in which I really, really hate. And also my biggest thing would be to go back home and tell the parents, I know America is a great place for opportunity, but just don't send your child to anybody. Yes, you want them to have a degree, you want them to do this, but let them live their life and let them grow up and decide that for themselves, because it really affects them. And we really need to really stop the human trafficking, because it really hurts.
In Catonsville, Cherie Johnson, ABC 2 News.
Well, thousands of women are recruited every year from poor countries to be live-in domestic workers here in the U.S. That's according to law enforcement officials and advocacy groups. At least 10,000 people are working as forced laborers at any given time here in the U.S. Meantime, Evelyn plans to continue her education at the University of Baltimore in the fall.
So that was Evelyn's story. So it does have a happy ending. But we use it because not every story is going to have a happy ending, but it does show you that if you work with, if you collaborate with law enforcement, lawyers, social workers, and other systems that surround the survivor, that you can actually make a difference in someone's life. So our work, even though it gets overwhelming, does have a hopeful possibility. So I include that as your sort of egging you on to keep doing what you're doing. And speaking of, so these are examples, these are just sort of visuals to show you the things that we buy that could have been touched by child labor or forced labor. This is wheat, cocoa, diamonds, and other minerals. These are children in Kazakhstan picking cotton. And this is a big campaign over the last couple of years where we're trying to raise awareness about this issue, because it's a state forced labor issue, but the government is pulling kids out of school, pulling the teachers out of school, and making them pick cotton, and then bricks and wheat. So I don't know if this video is actually going to work. Oh no, it didn't work. So I'm I want to show you one more. I know we're short on time, but it's really important. So just bear with me for 1 second. Have any of you guys heard of the dark side of chocolate?
Everybody loves chocolate. We eat more than 3 million tons a year. But behind the sweet taste, there is a dark side. But behind the sweet taste, there is a dark side. We've gone undercover with hidden cameras and assumed identities. We expose how African children as young as 8 years of age are smuggled across the border and used illegally in the chocolate industry. The dark side of chocolate. The true story of how your chocolate is produced.
So, I was going to show you a little bit of a longer clip where people used the footage from the dark side of chocolate and some of the things that you saw there as an advocacy tool, so that they were able to show sort of images from that film and then talk about fair trade chocolate and where chocolate comes from. But that one was about 5 minutes long, so I went and just showed you the trailer for that film because you should really check it out. It's a really sort of horrible thing, and they're targeting. After this film came out, a lot of the advocacy groups looked at the Hershey campaign, which I think was actually on one of the slides from the sociology students this morning, because Hershey is one that's targeted in the film, where they actually go and talk to the executives and say, like, this is happening in your supply chain, and they're one of the ones who are refusing to acknowledge or even don't do anything about it. And so I know Halloween is coming up, so if you have one thing that you can do without saving the world or changing the world, at least buy something else besides Hershey's. So this is another example of sort of educating yourself. This website just launched a few weeks ago, but it's really cool. I'm going to show you a demo. It's slaveryfootprint.org. I won't even work on this. I work on a Mac, so I don't know how the real world works sometimes. Okay, well, you can imagine. That's why I put it as a screenshot so you could see it. So it's like an interactive thing. So you click on it and it asks you things like how much, like, where do you live? Do you have any kids? Like, how much clothing is in your closet? Do you drive a car? Do you have a cell phone, etc.? And they ask you this sort of inventory of questions, and then every time you answer a question, it shows you places where slavery or child labor could be involved in that product that you have, and then it gives you like a sort of score at the end for your surroundings and your supplies. So I encourage you to check it out. I work in this field. I've been in this field for many years, and I did not score that well either. So I feel like the first step is to really educate yourself. We know that there are some things that you can do, particularly coffee and chocolate have a really well-developed fair trade labeling and movement system. So we know that there is no excuse not to buy fair trade coffee and chocolate in the U.S. It is widely available. And so for us, that just means educating people on its availability. And this is another screenshot of a Facebook campaign. It's called Reverse Trick or Treating. It's a few different advocacy organizations are involved, but basically how it works is it's like you get a little card that talks about slavery and chocolate, and then a little fair trade chocolate, and then the kids give it to the grown-ups who answer the door when they go trick-or-treating. And it's too late now, but every year you can go on a few weeks before, a couple months before Halloween, and actually order. So if you're a nonprofit or a school, you can get a whole bunch of those, and then you can organize it in your community or your neighborhood. And then if you're just an individual family, you're able to do that as well. And you can even make your own if you're really creative, because Halloween's still a few days away. So what you can do as a neighbor, well, we know that as we've heard a lot of, forced labor and trafficking are happening here in the U.S., and it's not something that just happens overseas. And so as a neighbor, as a good Samaritan, you can do something. As you've heard a lot of, if you suspect trafficking, don't put yourself in danger, but do call the trafficking hotline. Some of the questions that we ask when we're doing, there's a little typo there, but some of the questions that we ask when we're doing screening, and this is not comprehensive, but is the person being paid? Is she allowed to leave? Does she choose where she sleeps? Because what we heard a lot of is like, okay, being forced to sleep with the animals in agriculture and farming, but being forced to sleep in the basement, in the attic, in the yard, those kind of questions actually give you a lot of clues about the situation there. Same with eating. Were you allowed to eat at all? Or if you were, what were you forced to eat? Or what were you allowed to eat? And whether you're being threatened or your family at home is being threatened. So this little picture is of a book that just came out. Have you guys heard of Kevin Bales? Yeah, he's a writer and a sort of expert on human trafficking. And this book that he wrote here, which is one of his most recent ones, is specifically about trafficking in the U.S. I think this is almost my last slide. So then the last thing I'll say is there are things that you can do just being here, being an advocate. You can actually call Congress yourself, call your congressperson. You have a very famous and powerful senator who... Grassley. Yeah, thank you. So Grassley is on the Judiciary Committee. He's a hard target for us. I won't go into politics of it, but I'll just say that it's important that you reach out to him if you care about human trafficking. If you care about services and funding being available for victims, regardless of their immigration status, then you need to call your senator. There's other things, like internationally. One thing I'll mention is that last summer at the International Labor Organization in Geneva, they passed a convention on the rights of domestic workers. These are all domestic workers, but there's specific protections for migrant workers, which we think directly relate to trafficking of domestic workers. And so this is an example of an international labor convention that can be used by trafficking advocates as a stepping stone to get there. So we hope that the U.S. will ratify this, but as you probably can guess, it's not likely. But that doesn't stop us from advocating for it. And then the last thing I'll say is that there's a supply chain transparency bill in California which requires corporations doing business in California to post what they're doing to prevent trafficking and slavery in their supply chains. There's not consequence for it, though, so all they have to do is say what they're doing, and if they're not doing anything, they have to say that. The consequences, as a consumer, you can choose not to shop there. And there's talk of it being added as an amendment into the TVPA that's coming up for reauthorization now, but I don't know the status of that. Okay, that's it. Good. So now I have time for questions.
Do people have questions?
Tiffany, one of the things that would be helpful in addressing Grassley, since many of us could do that, is to know what his objections are so we can address the objections ahead of time rather than just say, oh, support this.
Sure.
So what are the objections?
Yes. There's,
Just grab the microphone.
oh, there's, okay.
Any of those.
There are two specific areas. One is that everybody in Congress is really worried about the budget deficit, but we have to reiterate that the services and the funding for trafficking survivors are already stretched. There's no fat in that budget. And so we need to make sure that that's protected and that that money is sustained at least at the level of where it is, but we know they need more. So I would say he's one of the folks who really is really talking about cutting costs, and sort of cutting that. The second thing that we're concerned about with Grassley is that we need to help him understand that immigrants really need, undocumented people really need the visa protection, because even though people are worried about too many immigrants coming to the U.S., the fact is the trafficking visa is really hard to get. And secondly, it makes or breaks a law enforcement case. If you tell somebody that they don't have any status and that they're going to be arrested, which is probable if they live in Arizona, Georgia, or Alabama now, if you say that there's no protection that's going to be offered to you if you come forward, or you make it really hard to get, or you make them afraid, then they're not going to come forward, and you're not going to address the issue. So to sum that up, I would say to reiterate the importance of immigration relief to everyone involved, in law enforcement and the survivor.
But don't you already have so many T visas and you're not even using them, so what would be the reason for doing more?
Well, we're actually not even advocating doing more than the cap at all. What the $5,000 person cap, as you saw earlier, we've only had 447 claimed in 2010 out of the 5,000 that were available. The problem is that they're trying to make it even harder to get than what it is. It's not that we're asking for more; it's that they're saying, no, they need to cooperate. They need to go into the courtroom. They need to do X, Y, and Z. Which, as advocates, we've been fighting to get those standards lowered to deal with a psychological exception.
In my conversations with Grassley directly, he's been very clear about human trafficking being only a law enforcement issue, that there's no room for nonprofits, for community organizations, for schools, for hospitals, for this and that, but only law enforcement and period. And get him out of that, that's the hard part. So.
My question is about, I hear during the day about developing the trust with the victim, or when we think we find a victim. And Alex and I, we had a couple of people that even though we could tell and they didn't want to come forward. I'm wondering, is the 1-800 hotline will provide that kind of support for somebody in Trinidad, or will you share some strategy of what else can we do to develop that trust? Because of course we cannot force it.
So the hotline is a good place to start for people who are ready to sort of report but don't really know if they qualify and those kind of things. But if you are an NGO or even an advocate or service organization, one of the best things that you can do is start networking and going out in communities where you know that there are potential victims. So, for example, for us in domestic work, we go to parks, we go to grocery stores, we talk about the rights of domestic workers in general, and we make our name known as a place that people can call that's safe. And so people, if they've experienced any kind of exploitation, have already heard of us as a place to go. So I would say if you're ethnic community-based organizations are a good place to make sure that you're starting to just get your name out there. And to build trust, I think it is hard. There's not a really quick answer to that, but I would say that if you make yourself known, you can go to the mayor's office, you can go to other places and put your flyers out and give brochures and say, if you hear of people who might be in this situation, like let them know we're here, and just be available.
More questions?
Yeah, just a quick question in regard to, you said about product, the Department of Labor is kind of listing all product that derive from forced labor and whatever, because all the offenders were much known, but what is the reluctance of the Department of Labor on listing companies, because we know that, most US companies use forced labor as well.
That's a really good question. We asked them that too. So the answer is that they say that tracing the supply chain all the way to the final retailer is really difficult, which is true. And the second thing they say, and I'm not bashing the DOL, you can go on their website and look at the report and look at the frequently asked questions, and that's one of them. The second thing that they say is that it's not within the scope of the TVPA for them to list the companies. So it's a lot of work, and they're not required to do it. That's the short and devastating answer.
Now, just want to expand it to my question.
Oh, sure.
In regard to mining companies and logging companies, we have companies like De Beers or Anglo Americans. They're directly involved in the sources. That was in the case in Sierra Leone and in the Congo, even for logging. They're well known because they buy from the source.
Yeah.
Why is that reluctance?
I think that's a political question, actually. But, I mean, we can't let that be the sort of end of the day, right? Because we know about it, and other groups are educating us and advocating about it. We know about De Beers. We know about Nike and the sweatshops. We know about these things. So even if our government isn't able to step up and say exactly what's going on and naming the companies, we've done a good job, and people in this room will continue to do a good job of finding out and educating ourselves. So I know that's not the best answer in the world, but that's the only one I can come up with.
I have a question. In the VTVPA reauthorization, is there anything that is being proposed or suggested for consumers to find out about companies and about the sources, following the thread of when and where a product is using slave labor or child labor?
I mean, I think that the closest thing would be the modeling of that California bill. So I think you guys should look this up. It's the California Supply Chain Act. And there's been a lot of movement in the Congress to add that as an amendment to the TVPA. So, I mean, I think why it's appealing is that there's no consequence, there's no sanction for companies if they're not doing something about it, but it does give the consumer the power to decide, oh, I'm not going to buy from there because they haven't listed what they're doing about it. So for us, it's a win because it's possible, it's feasible, even in this political climate. Would it be better if there were, like, hard consequences, like banning them from doing business in the U.S.? Yeah, that would be better, but that's not on the horizon anytime soon.
With regard to the California bill, is there a penalty for the company failing to investigate and report properly? And is there any check on that to ensure that they have done so?
So the law says that they are required to report. They're required to report even if they haven't done anything. So they could report, we have not investigated this. And that could be the end of the day. That's what they put in the sign. Are there real consequences? It doesn't appear that way, which is why a lot of groups, like the more activist groups like the International Labor Rights Forum, actually aren't that supportive of the bill because it doesn't have any teeth. But I'm supportive of it, and my organization is supportive of it simply for the fact that it raises awareness in consumer culture that we live in. We're always buying stuff. And so the more we can educate ourselves about even the possibility that this exists, whether or not the law has teeth, that's for us to work on together. But in the short term, at least we know that it's an issue.